Driven by a desire for revenge against the man who annihilated her people, she was forced into an act of compassion so radical that it would make her the only hope for the family of her greatest enemy. If stories about the power of compassion to break cycles of hate resonate with you, subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. The dust from the Sonoran desert rose in suffocating clouds, mingling the scent of dry earth and sage with the metallic odor of gunpowder and blood. Izil, whose name meant wind in her people's language, felt paralyzed, a breeze trapped in a hurricane of violence. Hours before, she had been gathering yucca roots, her skilled hands working in harmony with the earth that had nourished her. Now those same hands were stained with the dust kicked up by the boots of Mexican soldiers. She saw Captain Alejandro de la Cruz, mounted on his black horse, an imposing and cruel figure orchestrating the destruction of her village. Her eyes met his for an instant, and in that moment her world, her clan, her husband, everything was reduced to ashes and a deafening silence known only to grief. The ancestral healing knowledge she carried in her soul seemed a mockery in the face of the carnage surrounding her. Her capture was only the beginning of her humiliation. Bound and forced to march under the relentless sun, Izil was taken to the captain's hacienda, a white-walled fortress that rose like an arrogant scar on the sacred landscape. That place, an oasis of Mexican authority amid the disputed lands of her ancestors, became her prison. Within those walls, the Catholic and militaristic culture of the Creoles suffocated her, and every crucifix on the wall seemed a symbol of the oppression that had annihilated her own. She was now a servant, a trophy of war for the man who embodied her hatred. The small scar on her cheek, the mark of an ancient battle, now pulsed with new purpose. It was a constant reminder of the blood debt she had sworn to collect. Deep within her, the wind of her spirit had become a silent storm, waiting for the right moment to break free and destroy everything around her. The days at the hacienda dragged on in oppressive monotony, each dawn a reminder of her servitude. Izil moved like a shadow among the other servants, her gestures efficient but her spirit absent. She scrubbed the terracotta floors, feeling the cold stone like the chill in her own soul, and listened to the conversations in Spanish, a language she understood but refused to speak unless absolutely necessary. Contempt was a constant, a subtle poison served in the gazes of the other servants and in the captain's icy indifference. They saw her as a savage, an inferior being. But behind her submissive facade, Izil observed everything. She mapped the routine of the house, the guards' vigils, the way the captain scanned the horizon, perhaps searching for new villages to destroy. Hatred was the food that kept her going, the only living ember beneath the ashes of her old life, and she secretly fanned it, promising herself that one day it would become a bonfire. It was Elena, an old servant of mixed Apache and Mexican blood, who first saw the storm behind Izil's calm. With skin wrinkled like the bark of a desert tree and eyes that held the wisdom of one who had survived many seasons of drought, Elena watched the young Apache for weeks. She saw the rigidity in her posture, the fire contained in her gaze. One night, as they mended clothes by the light of a lantern, Elena approached. "They want you to break," she said softly, her speech a soft blend of dialects. "A dry branch breaks in the wind. Be like the river grass, which bends in the storm and rises again when the sun returns." Elena offered no pity, but a strategy. She began to teach Izil the art of seeing without being seen, to navigate the dangerous currents of that house, to understand that true strength lay not in direct confrontation, but in the quiet resilience that allows the seed to wait beneath the arid earth for the rain to come. Life on the hacienda followed its rigid routine, but a new presence began to register in Izil's consciousness. The captain's two young sons. She saw them from afar, creatures from a world not her own, dressed in clean linen and oblivious to the brutality that sustained their comfort. To Izil, they were merely extensions of her enemy, seeds of the same poisonous tree. Then a fever swept the region, entering silently through the fortress gates. The disease made no distinction between master and servant and attacked the captain's wife, a pale, devout woman with relentless ferocity. Izil watched from a distance as the prayers grew more desperate and the white man's remedies proved useless. In her heart, she held the knowledge of desert herbs that could combat evil, but her lips remained sealed. The death of Señora de la Cruz was, for her, an act of poetic justice from the universe. A small and bitter reparation for the loss of her own people. With the matriarch's death, a heavy and awkward veil of mourning fell over the hacienda. Captain Alejandro, a man accustomed to commanding armies and bending the world to his will, revealed himself to be an inept father and a lost widower. He sank into his grief, leaving his children, Mateo and little Sofia, adrift in a sea of confusion and sadness. They were like two birds with broken wings, ignored amid the solemn mourning of the adults. One night, passing through the inner courtyard, Izil found the boy huddled behind a ceramic vase, his crying silent and convulsive. In that moment, Izil's armor of hatred cracked. She didn't see the son of her people's murderer. She saw only an orphaned child, a mirror of the desolation she knew so well. An unexpected and painful compassion welled up in her chest, a feeling she didn't want, but which was as real as the ground beneath her feet. Izil's internal struggle at this moment is what inspires us. If you also feel the strength of this emotional crossroads, show your support by leaving a comment. And to not miss a step of this and other incredible journeys of overcoming, be sure to subscribe to the channel. The shadow of death, barely removed from the threshold of the house, returned with renewed cruelty, this time to claim little Mateo. The boy burned with fever, his frail body trembling beneath the sheets, the same symptoms that had taken his mother. For Captain Alejandro, the repetition of the nightmare was an unbearable torture. His authority, which ruled men and lands, was powerless against the disease consuming his son. He became a caged beast, his despair echoing through the corridors of the hacienda. Prayers seemed empty, the apothecary's potions ineffective. It was then that Elena's voice, cunning and calculated, found its way to the captain's ears, not directly, but through strategic whispers to other servants about the Indian woman who knew the healing secrets of the desert, secrets ignored by white people's medicine. The suggestion hung in the air thick with fear, a heresy that would soon become the only hope. Swallowing the pride that was as much a part of him as his own name, Alejandro went to Izil. He found her in the courtyard, and for the first time, he didn't look at her as a war prize, but as a last resort. The arrogance had vanished from his eyes, replaced by a raw, desperate plea. "Save my son," he commanded, but the word sounded more like a plea. "Do whatever it takes. If he survives, I swear." He didn't finish the sentence, for the promise of a man like him meant nothing to her. Izil stared at him, and in her silence, a war was waged. The spirit of vengeance demanded that she let her enemy's lineage end there, in the crib. But little Mateo's pale, sweaty face overshadowed the image of the captain. It was the life of an innocent child against the hatred for his father. With a slow, deliberate movement, she nodded, not for him, but for the boy, and for what she was above all, a healer. Under the watchful eye of two guards, Izil was allowed to return to her true temple, the desert. Her bare feet felt the familiar earth, and her hands, with a memory her brain had almost forgotten, found exactly what they were looking for. She gathered the resinous leaves of chaparral, a powerful plant her people called the ruler for its ability to conquer disease. She gathered white sage to purify the air, and specific roots to strengthen the ailing spirit. Back in the hacienda kitchen, she worked with a ritualistic concentration that silenced everyone around her. The sound of the pestle crushing the leaves was an ancient prayer, the aroma of the infusion rising in steam, a blessing. She chanted softly in D, the language of her people, not to the wooden saints on the walls, but to the spirits of earth, water, and life, invoking a power that this place of stone and imported faith had never known. For 2 days and 2 nights, Izil never left Mateo's side. She applied cold compresses to his forehead, gave him small doses of bitter tea, and filled the room with the purifying smoke of sage. At dawn on the 3rd day, the fever finally broke. The boy awoke, no longer delirious but weak and lucid. His eyes, large and dark, met Izil's, and instead of the fear she expected, she saw a pure, childlike trust. His small hand reached out and took hers. In that touch, the icy wall around Izil's heart cracked again. Their older sister, Sophia, who had watched from afar, approached timidly, her curiosity overcoming her distrust. To the children, Izil was no longer the frightening stranger. She was the woman who had faced the darkness and conquered it. A silent, deep bond was born there, forged in the fire of fever and the ancient wisdom of the land. The power dynamics within the hacienda had shifted subtly but irreversibly. Izil was still a prisoner, but her aura as a healer commanded a fearful respect. Captain Alejandro, torn between reluctant gratitude and deep distrust, made the pragmatic decision to make her the official caretaker of his children. He was a soldier, not a father, and in his wife's absence, the house had descended into a silent chaos that only Izil seemed capable of bringing order to. She accepted her new role with an ambivalence that tore at her core. Caring for Mateo and Sophia was an unexpected balm for the wound of her own loneliness, but also a constant reminder that she was nurturing the children of the man who had destroyed her life. Every gesture of affection toward them was a betrayal of her oath of revenge, a silent battle waged moment by moment in her heart. True magic, however, blossomed in secret. In quiet moments, when they were alone in the garden or in the children's room at night, Izil opened to them a universe that the Capitan's world tried to erase. Her voice, so long hidden, began to weave lullabies in her Ndi language. Melodies that spoke of the perseverance of cacti and the wisdom of the stars. She told them stories of her people, not of massacres, but of creation. Stories of Coyote, the trickster who taught important lessons, and of the white-painted woman who brought blessings. For Mateo and Sophia, those whispered words were like water on dry land, awakening their imaginations. For Izil, it was an act of sacred resistance. By sharing her heritage with the children of her enemy, she was, without realizing it, finding her way back to her own humanity. The change in the children was visible for all to see. Laughter, a sound that had died out with their mother's death, once again filled the corners of the hacienda. Captain Alejandro watched from his porch, a solitary, austere figure, as his children followed Izil through the garden, absorbed in her stories. He saw Mateo trying to imitate the bird calls she had taught him, and Sophia braiding flowers into her hair, just as he had seen her captive do. A complex mix of feelings assailed him. Relief at seeing them happy, jealousy that their affection was not directed at him, and a reluctant admiration for the woman he had subjugated. The order and discipline with which he had built his life seemed fragile and ineffective in the face of the serene, inexplicable strength emanating from her, a strength that was undeniably healing his family's deepest wounds. Eleanor, with her quiet wisdom, sensed the deeper transformation, the one occurring within. Izil, she noticed how the hard line in his jaw had softened and how his eyes, once mirrors of cold pain, now reflected the light of children's play. One afternoon, while they were working together, the old servant gently touched Izil's arm. "Hate is a heavy anchor," she said softly. "It holds you in place, but it prevents you from sailing. Letting life flourish, even in the most unlikely soil, is not forgetting those who have passed. It is honoring them, showing that the spirit they gave you cannot be broken. Elena's words were like gentle rain, finally penetrating the hardened earth. Izil began to accept that her compassion was not a betrayal, but the purest expression of her people's resilience, a testament to the fact that even in the ashes, life insists on sprouting. The months wove a routine of fragile peace. On a mild, sunny afternoon, Izil stood with the children in an interior courtyard, teaching them to make small clay figures, the same way she had learned from her grandmother. Sophia, with dirty hands and a radiant smile, showed her a crooked bird, while Matteo concentrated on making a snake. In that moment, under the blue Sonoran sky, the walls of the hacienda seemed to disappear. Izil was not a captive, and they were not the children of her enemy. They were simply three souls finding solace and joy in the simplicity of creation. The weight of revenge, which for so long had been her only companion, seemed to have dissipated in the afternoon heat, replaced by a lightness she hadn't known she was still capable of feeling. For the first time in years, her heart was not at war, but in a state of serene and unexpected grace. The peace was shattered by a piercing scream from the watchtower, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire tearing through the air. Chaos erupted instantly. Servants ran in panic, the Capitan barked orders, and the guards rushed to the walls. Izil's body froze, every muscle tensed by a memory of terror. She looked beyond the gates and saw the dust rising, the silhouettes of horsemen moving with the lethal speed of her own people's warriors. But there was a reckless ferocity in their attacks, a brutality she recognized as the mark of the renegades, those who had lost the path of honor. A year ago, she would have seen an opportunity, perhaps even allies. Now, her first and only thought was of the two children at her side. Without hesitation, she grabbed them, pulling them into the shadow of an archway, her body instinctively transforming into a human shield. With the sound of battle roaring around her, Izil's mind became a haven of clarity. All the knowledge she had accumulated about the hacienda, its architecture, every corridor and secret passage she had once mapped for her revenge, was instantly redeployed to salvation. Grabbing Matteo and Sophia's small, trembling hands, she led them through the pandemonium, not to the obvious shelters, but to a place only she and the oldest servants knew: a small wine cellar, forgotten behind heavy shelves in the main pantry. The air there was cool and smelled of earth and time. "Listen carefully," she whispered, her face level with theirs, her voice steady despite the thunder outside. "Stay here in the dark. Act like the little desert fox in its den. Make no sound until my voice calls you. I promise I will return." She saw the terror in their eyes, but also an absolute trust that broke her heart. Having locked them safely, Izil leaned against the door. For a moment, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. She could hear the invaders' voices now, speaking a crude version of her own language, desecrating her with cries of greed and violence. They were close, ransacking the rooms for valuables. Fear compelled her to stay there, to become a barrier of flesh and blood to protect the children. Yet Eleanor's wisdom and the instincts of her people told her otherwise. To defend passively was to invite discovery. She needed a ruse, a distraction. I swept the room and landed on a heavy iron poker beside a cold oven. It was a pathetic weapon, but her plan wasn't to fight, it was to deceive. With the iron in hand, she moved silently in the opposite direction, ready to become a ghost and haunt the invaders, driving them away from her precious secret. Moving like a spirit through the bustling corridors, Izil found what she sought: the grand dining room. The battle had already passed through, leaving a trail of overturned furniture and broken china. On one wall hung a massive, heavy oak cabinet filled with silverware. It was a perfect target. Using the iron poker as leverage and summoning all her strength, she forced it forward. The cabinet toppled over with a cataclysmic crash, a sound of splintering wood and clashing silver that echoed throughout the hacienda like thunder. The noise was so violent and destructive that it was sure to attract anyone nearby. Immediately, she retreated into the shadows of an adjacent hallway, her heart pounding in her throat, hoping her dangerous bait would be taken, drawing the danger away from the pantry. The ruse worked better than she expected. Two renegade warriors, their faces scarred with war paint and their eyes shining with greed, burst into the dining room, drawn by the sound of destruction. Izil held her breath, huddled in the darkness. It was then that she saw him. Slumped near the fireplace, partially hidden by the dust and debris, was Captain Alejandro. He was bleeding. From a deep wound in his side, his breathing a shallow, painful gasp, and his pistol lay just out of reach. The warriors saw him instantly, and a cruel smile spread across their faces. The great white wolf, the butcher of their people, was there, wounded and at their mercy. In that moment, fate offered Izil, on a bloody silver platter, the revenge she had prayed for. One gesture, or lack thereof, was all it took for justice to be served. The universe held its breath, and for an eternal instant Izil stood on the brink of her choice. In her mind, past and future fought a final battle. She saw the flames devouring the homes of her people, heard their screams, felt the sharp pain of the loss that had defined her for so long. Hatred, her faithful companion, whispered in her ear that this was the promised justice, the sacred reckoning. She only had to remain in the shadows for the blood debt to be paid. But overshadowing these images of fire and smoke, the faces of Mateo and Sophia appeared. She saw the pure trust in their eyes, felt the warmth of their small hands in hers. If she allowed their father to die, she would be giving them the same poisoned gift she had received, an orphaned heart filled with hate. She would not be ending a cycle of violence, but rather forging the next link in the chain. As one of the renegades' battle axe began its downward arc, Izil moved. She didn't run, didn't scream. She simply emerged from the shadows, a silent, determined apparition, and stood directly in the path of the blow. The iron poker fell from her hand, clanging against the stone floor, a clear sign that she did not seek combat. She looked directly into the eyes of the warriors, her equals, and spoke in her native tongue, Ndi. "Stop," she said. The word was spoken softly but carried an unshakable authority that cut through the violence-laden air. Both men froze, shock paralyzing their muscles. The scene was an impossible paradox. A woman of her own blood, a captive, defending with her own body the life of the Mexican butcher they had come to destroy. Their world turned upside down in that instant. The silence was broken by the incredulous and furious voice of one of the warriors. "What are you doing, woman? Get out of the way. He is the killer of our brothers." He spat the words in Ndi. Izil stood her ground, her small body a fortress. "The blood he spilled will not be washed away with more blood," she replied, her voice resonating with an ancient wisdom that surprised even herself. At that very moment, the tide of battle brought more witnesses. 3 Mexican soldiers, their uniforms torn and their faces stained with gunpowder, appeared in one of the hall's arches. They stopped, rifles at the ready, completely stunned by the scene. Their captive Indian was protecting her commander from the enemy warriors. For a long, tense second, the hatred on both sides was suspended, neutralized by the incomprehensible action of a single woman, defying all logic of war and common sense. Izil made her final move, ignoring the renegade's guns in front of her and the soldiers' rifles behind her. She turned and knelt beside Alejandro. The entire world seemed to disappear, and her focus narrowed to the wounded body of the man she hated most. Her hands, which had so often dreamed of plunging a knife into his chest, now moved with the precision of a healer. She tore a strip from the hem of her own skirt and pressed it tightly to the wound to staunch the bleeding. It was an act of compassion so radical, so defiant, that it silenced the room. In that moment, she was not Apache or captive, and he was not Mexican or captain. They were simply a woman desperately trying to prevent death from claiming a man, the father of 2 children who waited for her in a dark basement. Izil's gesture, the act of healing amidst the chaos, was a force more powerful than any weapon in that room. For the renegade warriors, the scene became taboo. Fighting soldiers was war, but violating the sacred space of a woman of their people, practicing the act of preserving life, was a desecration. The fury in their eyes gave way to a deep, superstitious confusion. They stared at each other, the language of violence suddenly useless. Outside, the sound of battle intensified with the arrival of Mexican reinforcements, making their continued presence there a death sentence. With a last, perplexed look at Izil, who remained oblivious to them, focused only on the wounded. The renegades retreated. They fled not from the soldiers, but from a spiritual enigma they could not decipher, leaving the room in stunned silence. Slowly, the sounds of battle throughout the hacienda faded, replaced by the cries of the wounded and the crackling of distant flames. The attack had ceased. In the destroyed hall, Izil did not move. She kept pressure on Alejandro's wound, feeling the faint but steady pulse beneath her fingers. The Mexican soldiers finally lowered their weapons and approached, their steps hesitant in the rubble-strewn room. They regarded the Apache woman no longer as a servant, but as a mystery. She, the savage, the prisoner, had been the only one who had not wavered in protecting her leader. A sergeant, the oldest among them, finally broke the spell, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Help her," he ordered his men. "We need to move him." With that order, Izil's status changed forever, though no one yet knew what she had become. In the days of fever and pain that followed, authority at the hacienda passed from the wounded captain to his healer. Izil commanded the sick room with a quiet competence that no one dared question. She prepared herbal infusions to combat the infection and applied compresses of crushed agave leaves to reduce the swelling, openly using the wisdom she had previously had to hide. The servants, who had previously despised her, now brought water and bandages at her simple gesture. Her care was meticulous, tireless, yet strangely impersonal. She was not treating Alejandro, the man. She was tending to a wounded body, preserving the life that was the pillar of Mateo and Sophia's world. This dissociation was the only way to reconcile her oath as a healer with the memory of the victim that still lived within her. Alejandro emerged from his delirium on a silent night, his mind finally lucid. The pain in his body was a gentle simmer, but nothing compared to the piercing clarity of his memory. He remembered the cold steel of fear as he faced death, the warrior's exultant face, the axe raised, and then, like an apparition, the image of Izil standing before him. She, from whom he had stolen her husband, her people, and her freedom, had offered her own back to protect him. He looked across the room and saw her in the candlelight, preparing a new bandage, her profile focused and serene. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The woman he had seen as an object, a trophy of war, possessed a nobility and moral strength that dwarfed his own military honor. The debt he now owed her was unpayable, and the weight of that act of mercy began to reshape his soul. When strength returned to his body, Alejandro sent for Izil. She entered, expecting further orders about her care, but found him sitting, his gaze fixed and heavy. The silence in the room was different, no longer the dynamic between master and servant, but something new and uncomfortable. "I took everything from you," he finally said, the words coming out thickly like stones. "Your people, your family, your future. I brought you here as a symbol of my victory." He paused, shame evident on his pale face. "And when justice came for me at the point of an axe, you stood in the way. You gave me back the life I didn't deserve." He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he truly saw her. I cannot return what was destroyed. I can only return what I still hold captive. From this moment on, you are free, Izil. You can go wherever you wish. Freedom. The word echoed in Izil's mind, a long-forgotten sound, the promise of the wind in her face and the open earth beneath her feet. For a moment, the image of the distant mountains, the spiritual home of her people, called to her with overwhelming force. She could leave, try to find the remnants of her clan, be Izil, the wind, once more. But then, from the courtyard, she heard the unmistakable sound of Mateo's laughter. She thought of Sophia, of how the girl now braided her own hair the way Izil had taught her. She had lost one clan, but against all odds, she had found another, small and fractured, but hers to protect. With a calm that surprised her, she met the Capitan's gaze. "I accept my freedom," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And as a free woman, I choose to stay. My place is no longer out there. My place is here, with them." Thus, a new, quiet order was established within the hacienda walls. Izil was no longer a servant, nor a prisoner, but a silent matriarchal force. Meals, once an exercise in hierarchy and formality, now included her presence at the table, at Alejandro's own insistence. He, in turn, had visibly changed. The authoritarian captain had given way to a quieter, more observant man, who saw in Izil's gestures toward his children a lesson in fatherhood he had never learned. He watched her teach Sophia how to find edible plants in the garden, or soothe Mateo's night terrors with a story in her native tongue. The power dynamic between conqueror and conquered had dissolved, replaced by an unlikely partnership, based not on affection, but on mutual responsibility and respect earned at a terrible cost. The true foundation of this new family, however, was built on the shared ground of loss. Each of them carried the ghost of a stolen love. Alejandro, his wife, the children, their mother, and Izil, her husband, and her entire world. One day, finding her children staring sadly at a portrait of their mother, Izil did not distract them. Instead, she sat with them and shared a tradition of her people, that the memories of those we love are like seeds we carry with us, and that by remembering them, we water them and keep them alive in our hearts. Alejandro, witnessing the scene from afar, understood that she was not trying to replace his deceased wife, but rather teaching everyone, including him, to live with absence. Shared grief became their secret language, a bridge of empathy across the chasm of hatred that once separated them. The years flowed by, transforming the landscape of the hacienda and the souls within. Mateo and Sophia grew up on the threshold of two worlds. From their father, they learned the customs and faith of their Mexican heritage. From Izil, they learned the wisdom of the land, the names of the stars in the Apache language, and respect for all life. They became the embodiment of the bridge Izil had built. Children whose empathy was as natural as breathing, able to see the world through more than one set of eyes. The hacienda, once an outpost of conquest, became a rare bastion of coexistence. The ashes of the massacre were not forgotten, but had become the fertile soil from which a new understanding, embodied in those children, could finally blossom. The relationship between Izil and Alejandro crystallized in a deep, silent respect. The chasm between them, carved by violence and loss, could never be fully bridged, and there was never any pretense of romance, or even friendship. They were like two solitary trees that, having survived the same storm, now offered shade to the same young shoots. Sometimes they would meet on the porch at dusk, watching the children play. No words were necessary. There was a shared understanding that they were both guardians of a peace that had cost everything. He saw in her the strength of resilience, an honor his sword could never conquer. She saw in him an irrevocably changed man who had learned the hard way that true power lies not in taking, but in being able to protect. One late afternoon, as the sky turned orange, Izil sat beside Elena, now an old woman whose skin bore the map of nearly a century of memories. The old woman held Izil's hand, a hand no longer that of a frightened young woman, but that of a serene and strong woman. "I told you many years ago to be like the bending grass," Elena whispered, her voice a breath of time. "But you were more. You became the river itself. You not only survived the current, but changed its course and made life blossom where there was only stone." In those words, Izil saw the full reflection of her journey. She had not merely adapted to survive. She had transformed the very soil of her prison into a home, using the quiet power of compassion to reshape the destinies of everyone around her. Izil finally understood the nature of the heart she had offered. It was not the fragile heart of a woman in love, but the resilient heart of a healer, the core of her identity. The path of revenge, she realized, would have hollowed her out, transforming her into nothing more than an echo of the violence she had suffered. By choosing compassion, she did not offer Alejandro her affection, but rather the essence of her people, the ability to nurture life even amidst desolation. She gave those children the heart of their culture, their stories, their wisdom. It was an act of giving that was, at its core, the ultimate act of recovery. By giving that heart, she did not diminish herself. On the contrary, she reclaimed the deepest part of herself that war had tried to erase, making herself whole once more. The final image of that unlikely family was etched in the hacienda's memory. On a golden afternoon, Alejandro, now a gray-haired man with relaxed shoulders, watched from the porch. In the courtyard, Izil taught a teenage Mateo how to identify rabbit tracks, while Sophia, now a young woman with her mentor's serenity, showed her father a rare dessert. Flower she had learned to cultivate. They were four figures in harmony, an ecosystem of peace, born from the most violent of storms. The family they built was not of blood, but of choice. A choice made in the midst of fire, renewed with each dawn, proving that the strongest bonds are not those we inherit, but those we have the courage to forge from the shards of a broken world. The story of Izil and Alejandro became a whisper on the desert wind, a parable about the nature of war and peace. It taught that the cycle of retribution, a law that seems as natural and immutable as thirst in a drought, can be broken, not by great armies or treaties signed by great men, but by the defiant decision of a single individual to choose healing over wounding. True strength, as proved in that isolated house, lay not in the ability to annihilate an enemy, but in the courage to create a future for their children. Hatred was a fire that consumed all, but compassion was the water that could patiently transform even the most arid of ashes into a place where life dared to blossom again. Izil, the woman whose name meant wind, found her true sense of self not in the fury of the storm, but in the gentleness of the breeze. The wind of her youth had been a hurricane of pain, seeking to destroy the fortress that imprisoned her. But she learned that the wind's greatest strength lies not in its violence that uproots trees, but in its ability to carry seeds to barren lands, to spread the pollen that generates new life, and to whisper through the canyons, telling stories of perseverance. She didn't need to tear down the walls of the hacienda. Instead, her spirit blew through their cracks, depositing seeds of compassion that, over time, grew and transformed the barren rock of that place into fertile soil for future generations. Izil's story teaches us that resilience lies not in the strength with which we hold on to our hatred, but in the courage we find to offer compassion and break the cycles of violence. If this message touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share this journey so it can inspire others to choose healing over revenge. We'd be honored to hear from where you're watching. Please let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for joining us on this story of strength and transformation, and see you on our next journey.